All right. Thank you, Elijah, for taking the time out to talk with me today. How's it going?
Thanks for having me. Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. So yeah, we're super thrilled to be having some of your music available through PSNY, and I thought I would just start by asking like where your music comes from. Like, what kind of sounds are you interested in? What kind of feelings or textures or phenomena or
Yeah.
anything are you interested in compositionally?
Yeah. I think a lot of my music lately I've been very drawn to sounds that I guess could be best described as noticeably off. Things that sound like a recognizable musical object or something along those lines, or something that your ear expects it to be one way, and it's very much just enough of not that for it to be noticeable. And I've been very interested in sort of visually things that are, falling apart, old buildings that are decaying, or things that are being reclaimed by nature, I think is a term that has been going around a lot lately. And that has always sort of drawn my eye because there's something interesting to me about this thing that oftentimes is loaded with connotations, just falling apart and decaying. And as a result, I think that's found its way into my music, in the way in which I think about textures and timbres and things that sound as though it's just enough to be recognizable, but also just enough to notice that it's sort of not that thing anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting thing about that is that representations of decay are often visual, right? Like photographs, films, you can see decay and maybe you can smell it sometimes. Um, but I wonder how you think about how one hears that sense of decay, or maybe decay is not the right word for it, something else.
Yeah, I have no idea what the right word for it would be. But I think for me, I think there are a lot of different ways that you can approach that. Timbrally, you can approach decay by, literally messing with instruments. I like preparing pianos in a way that, I think a lot of the time if you play a broken piano, it sometimes sounds very similar to certain piano preparations. So there are things like that that are sort of obvious, I guess, like one-to-one relationships. But then there are also things that I think, in terms of larger musical objects, having, things like broken unisons or harmonies that are slightly recognizable as a traditional harmony, like a triad, but with some things thrown in there, like
Mhm.
some microtonal colorations or inflections that are enough to say, like, "Oh, what's wrong with that chord right there?" Um, so I think there are a number of ways to sort of approach it. That's definitely those two things, sort of like messing with instruments and finding different extended techniques to
Mhm.
make them sound like altered versions of themselves. I think that's one way I do it, and then I also like to just use various musical objects and broken sort of musical structures that sound enough like their original selves for us to notice that something's wrong with it.
Does it also like manifest itself on the level of form, like in time?
That's a great question. I have not given that any thought. That's probably an area that I really should explore a lot more because I think there's
Oh,
a lot to explore there. I think it would probably require a little more familiarity with, any sort of given form or structure.
yeah.
I think which might lead to an interesting conversation about what is recognizable and what isn't. But I think it's definitely something
Mm.
that I should explore at the very least. So,
Looking forward to hearing you do that. Well, I guess on a similar note, like the kind of formal or constraints, or maybe not constraints, but specifications of your work, when you think about sounds that are slightly off, or sounds that are kind of decaying, or sounds that are aging or falling apart, um, are there particular instruments or ensembles that you are drawn to explore that? And I guess a related question is, when you compose, are you sitting at a keyboard? Are you with a guitar? Are you in Pro Tools, or how does that look for you?
Yeah, I think the instrumentations. Well, I'll start with the second question. I usually write somewhere in between, in a DAW and at the keyboard and randomly. I think with a lot of the stuff that I've been doing lately, I like to aggressively sample things. So, because I don't have access to all these instruments on a daily basis, so I really like sampling things and sort of putting those in Logic and sort of just sitting with the sounds for a while, rearranging them, and that way I can actually get a good idea of what something will sound like, and then that will also sort of spark some other ideas along the way. Um, and you know, I really enjoy writing for percussion, just because I feel like the term percussion is so broad that it doesn't really, to me as like a composer, doesn't really mean something specific like drums or orchestral percussion or anything like that, where it's any object that can kind of be played in a musical way. I think of as percussion. So there are limitless sort of opportunities to do things with that. And I also really like, lately I've really enjoyed writing for Sinfonietta because I feel as though it is you know another diverse sort of color palette where you have so many different options and choices, um, but in a way that still feels a little bit closer to chamber music than full orchestra. So some of the things that I think there's a certain delicacy that I think is inherent, not necessarily, maybe not inherent, a certain delicacy that is um, more readily available for a sinfonietta than there would be for an orchestra. So sort of exploring individual instruments, capabilities, I think is can often be more readily audible in a sinfonietta because there are few of them, or fewer of them than a full orchestra. But in both of those, I still sort of really like this idea of sort of finding these weird little quirky things about instruments that they can do that makes them sound a little bit like something other than what they are. I think you're muted, by the way.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries.
My infant was making a lot of noise in the background. Um, yeah, I think so. Sitting down and being able to kind of craft sound at a computer is interesting because it also connects to the idea of like having a lot of different instruments kind of available to you. And it makes sense that Sinfonietta would be a kind of an interesting, like not a compromise, but maybe like a middle ground between like having a lot of available timbres and different combinations and counterpoint and stuff, but also keeping the music more intimate in a smaller ensemble. But I was curious about, I know that you've done some multimedia work as well, some film and some, I don't know if you would consider this scoring, like the music and the film, or but I would just be curious to hear you talk a bit about that side of your work, using sound and visuals together.
Yeah, I think like most people around my age grew up with movies and grew up with TV shows, and I think like a lot of again, like a lot of people in music nowadays, I think film scores are sort of my first way into thinking about music and composition as like a thing. Um, but I tend to I tend to look at a lot of the visual work that I've done as sort of like, rather than a film and then a score to that, where the score is supplemental, to have it as sort of a dialogue between the two, and both of them influence each other. So the project that I have with my website, Come Clarity, was more along the lines of coming up with a concept for both of them, and or one singular concept, and thinking about how that concept can apply both to film and sound and music. So for that one, I was thinking a lot about collage in other art forms than actual physical collage, and sort of what you can do with that. And so for the film and the music, the idea behind it was that I would put in images and sounds and music that have very specific meanings to me because of my personal associations or experiences with those things, and then creating something out of it that doesn't necessarily make those associations sort of noticeable or intelligible to the listener, but maybe giving enough there that the sort of sentiment behind them is there. And I think that in music in general, because it is such a quote unquote abstract art form, I think sort of something that I've been very interested in for a while is this notion of how do we express specificity in music, and is specificity necessary for someone to perceive the general sentiment behind it. So that was sort of what I was exploring in that, and having both of them speak to each other rather than one of them being subservient to the other.
I see. Yeah. Um, yeah, cool. I guess I would love to also hear you talk about some what you're working on now, what's kind of coming up for you that you're excited about. And maybe if yeah, if those works connect to or don't our our conversations about like um things kind of sounding off or falling apart or um being erased or under erasure. Yeah, would
Yeah.
love to hear a bit more about what you're working on right now.
Yeah, so the two projects that I have coming up right now, three projects that I have coming up right now. One is for an ensemble out in Colorado called the El Matson Collective, which I'm really excited about. It's going to be, as you were saying, sort of playing with the idea of erasure, from poetry and sort of blackout poetry. So taking a text, poem called Neutral Tones by Thomas Hardy, and then erasing a bunch of it and sort of creating something new from that and using that as the basis for the actual piece. So I've got that, and then I've got a piece coming up for Yarn Wire, which, again, percussion. And, you know, I think that's going to be really, especially at this point in, what I'm thinking about, I think it'll be a lot of fun to work with two pianos and two percussions so that I can destroy four different things in four different ways and sort of find equivalent gestures and ideas between them. And what would it sound like if I did this on one of those instruments, and how would that sound on the other instruments, and what's an equivalent motion? And
Mhm.
then I've got a piece coming up for Alarm Will Sound as well, which is Sinfonietta. So maybe I'm gravitating towards those things, conceptually, because that's what I have coming up.
Mhm.
But either way, I think it's good. I'm really excited about all those projects, just because it feels like each and every one of them gives me an opportunity to really explore something that's been on my mind quite a bit recently. And they're all phenomenal musicians, and I think they're all going to be a lot of fun to work with. So I'm pumped.
Yeah, yeah, that's those all sound like fantastic projects. Great. Well, thanks for taking the time out to talk with me briefly. I guess, are there any final thoughts that you have about like the works that are up on PSNY, which I'll just run through the list really quick. We have Perihelion, Sax Quartet, Submergences String Quartet, Looking into Silence String Quartet, and Soprano, and then Shifting Ground, which is percussion quartet. Um, any one of those works would kind of stand out or particularly important, not important to you, or like connecting with this idea of like destruction or erasure or falling apart?
Yeah, yeah. I think Submergences, Perihelion, and Shifting Ground they're all written kind of back to back, and I think there's a sort of through line between them where it is thinking a lot about things falling apart, broken unisons, things that are again noticeably off. So I think those three I sort of think of as like one larger exploration of a single concept. And then for Looking into Silence, that was my first time experimenting with erasure in music. And so I, used T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland as a sort of foundation and erased a bunch of that, and then sort of applied techniques and concepts of erasure. And if people don't know what erasure is, it's essentially the idea of taking a poem and literally just erasing or blacking out chunks to make a new poem. And I was very interested in the idea of like, can that work musically? How does that work musically? Because, in music, it's time based in a way that poetry isn't necessarily. And, when you look at a blackout poem, you can immediately see, okay, there was something behind that. But then sort of, asking myself like, well, is that possible in music to hear absence unless it's something that we're already familiar with? And so I don't know if I ever came to any conclusions with that, but I sort of use this idea of negative space and absence as sort of a driving force for that piece, to think about, what does it mean to, is it going to be noticeable if I take something that no one's heard and just, get rid of a bunch of it? And if it's not noticeable, fine, but hopefully it'll sound good anyway. So yeah, those are the four pieces
Mm.
that are coming up. And I think Looking into Silence maybe is a slight shift away from, the ideas behind the three other quartets, but then at the same time, I think they're all building on each other successively. So
Yeah, awesome. That sounds like a really interesting theoretical or like aesthetic and theoretical arc. Um, it's interesting to think of the idea of what it means to hear something that you didn't know what it means to not hear something that you didn't know like you're missing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think going back to what I was talking about with come clarity of this idea of is is the sort of noticeability of a sort of compositional idea necessary for the enjoyment of a piece.
Hmm.
So, with looking into silence, just sort of asking myself, like, does it matter if the listener knows how I made this if they enjoy it? And maybe the end goal is using it as a platform to write something cool rather than using it as a means of explaining an idea to someone who might just want to listen to a cool piece of music. So,
Yeah. Well, I think most people will find it enjoyable to listen to,
thank you.
but perhaps even more if if they think about the more kind of philosophical underpinnings of it as well.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, too awesome. Well, yeah, I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I guess let's leave it here and to be continued. And yeah, thanks again.
thank you.
Okay, awesome.